From the twisted ruins of the World Trade Center to the mountains of Tora Bora and cities like Fallujah and beyond, generations of American men and women have answered the call to service, many making the ultimate sacrifice, and many more returning home with lifelong scars of war. And for almost 2 decades, their struggle has increasingly played out in the shadows, first falling away from the front pages of national newspapers, and then falling further away again under a veil of secrecy about what is happening in far-flung places like Somalia, Nigeria, Kenya, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Places where our government wages violence out of sight and out of mind. Welcome to The Ask. I am your host, Weiss Azimi, and for this episode, my co-host Cliff W. Gilmore and I have the honor and privilege of speaking with award-winning author, newspaper columnist, and veteran Phil Klay. Our episode guest, Phil Klay, has served as an officer in the United States Marine Corps and has won the National Book Award for Fiction for his first book, Redeployment, and has been recognized by the National Book Foundation as a 5 under 35 honoree. Phil's 2020 novel titled Missionaries was named as one of President Obama's favorite books of the year and was recognized by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 10 best books of the year. In his latest book, Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless Invisible War, Phil has carefully assembled 10 years of thought-provoking writing that challenges the reader to ask, in the name of what do we ask young Americans to kill and to die? And in the name of what exactly does this country now hang together? Beyond those questions, Uncertain Ground is a gripping meditation that takes elements of Phil's own life and career to look at ideas around service, citizenship, war, and grief, and the increasingly uncertain future direction of our great country, and so much more. Let us now meet our guest Phil Klay and discuss Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in an Age of Endless Invisible War. I would like to welcome everyone back to The Ask. I am Weiss Azimi, together here with my co-host, Cliff W. Gilmore, an author and Marine Corps veteran, Phil Klay. Phil, thank you for being here with us today to discuss your latest book. I will toss over the first question to my co-host, Cliff.
Oh, appreciate it, Weiss. Thanks so much. And for the listeners out there, I want to let them know Phil and I do go back a bit. So I wouldn't want anybody to think that it was one of those stories where like, oh, there we were in the stuff together. You know, Phil and I were with 2nd Marine Division for an overlap period of about 3 months, I think. You were coming back from places and I was getting ready to head out to places. And we were a hodgepodge of Marines sort of cobbled together to hold the line back in North Carolina at Camp Lejeune, while so many other people were deployed at that time. And a big part of our job at that time, if I recall correctly, had to do with accounting for gear because we hadn't at that point really gotten ourselves together on how gear went out for deployments. We were ad hoc, units.
What had happened was there were like a bunch of Connex boxes where all the gear had been thrown. And then the last person who had ever accounted for the gear had been years ago, and they had been kicked out of the Marine Corps and sent to jail. And so there were like all of these different bits of camera gear that were all parts of like, they were supposed to be complete packages, and it was all just sort of thrown together, and trying to figure out what we had and what we were missing. It was sort of like, you know, if somebody had taken 15 jigsaw puzzles, thrown out a quarter of the pieces, and then thrown them all together, and you had to, you know, figure out what went where, what you were missing. It was fun.
On top of that, then, if I recall correctly, we ended up
the thrilling life of a Marine Corps officer.
We did. It was straight out of Catch-22 or something. And then on top of that, we handled, I think it was the Weimunk murder case at that point. So in the middle of accounting for all that gear, there was that was that period of time, was it not? And yeah. So we won't go into all the details about that one, but suffice to say that the other side, another aspect of the life of a Marine public affairs officer, is that you handle the ugly stuff, which thankfully is rare, and you're building and dealing with that ugly stuff on the relatively strong reputation of an organization that's been around for quite a while. But where that is so Phil and I had the opportunity to serve together. He was, I guess it wasn't command at the time, but he was under my tutelage. And what I recall thinking back at the time was when I was watching Phil and several of the other lieutenants that we were working with, I remember thinking as a major, holy geez, If I had come in as a lieutenant right now, I would not have been competitive. The quality of the lieutenants that I was working with at that time were phenomenal. The things that you were experiencing and dealing with and managing and decisions you were responsible for making were really quite something. What stands out to me, Phil, is that you told me at the time, I'm paraphrasing, but you said you joined the Marine Corps to gain a few experiences and then you planned to go off and become a writer. And you went off and immediately, it probably looks far easier from the outside than it was in the reality of your world, I'm sure. But you put together a book called Redeployment, which is a combination of short fiction stories that are drawn from real experiences. I certainly recognize a few things inside those works. And then that was the American Book Award, I think you pulled down for that one.
The National Book Award.
National Book Award, immediately. So what struck me early on was Phil was very focused, very intelligent, and had a great sense of humor as well, and said, I'm going to go be a writer. You went out, you became a writer, pulled that award down. And then your next book was Missionaries, which was a novel. And in the background, while those were coming out, you were writing a lot of nonfiction, a lot of essay work that was being published. And so leading into, I guess question one, if you will, I'm curious just to ease in, loosen our tongues a bit on what took you to this third book as a compilation of essays.
Yeah. So I was always writing nonfiction alongside the fiction. I mean, it's a different muscle. It's a different sort of thing. You're inviting the reader in alongside you in an argument that you're having. Sometimes an argument that you're having with yourself, things that you're trying to piece together. Whereas fiction is very much about immersing the reader in an experience, right? That you find vitally important, that you want them to respond to at a visceral level. And as I was writing these, it became clear to me and clear to my editor that the essays that I was working on weren't just sort of a series of kind of scattershot pieces, but rather they were building together an argument and kind of broader intellectual and emotional response to American war making over the past, 2 decades, and that they belong together in a collection, right? It's not every essay. I mean, these are selected essays of the work that I've done, but you come back from a war zone, as I did, and I think there's sort of 2 very basic questions, right? The book is divided into 4 sections: citizens, soldiers, writing, and faith. And when you come back, the 2 very basic questions are like, okay, what was that, right? What was that war that I was part of? What was going on? And what does this place at home look like now that I've come back, right? Because it feels very different, and because you're acutely aware of the strange linkage between the political decisions and attitudes stateside and, the war that you had seen close at hand. And then, so those are the sort of the first 2 parts of the book. Then there's also the kind of very basic question of how to communicate those things, because I think when you come back, you, on the one hand, are kind of given a license to pontificate, right? I've been over there, I can tell you about Iraq, and yet you don't really necessarily know what you talk about. But oftentimes they're very sort of difficult discussions of things that are vitally important to you that you might not know how to communicate, right? I remember there was a National Guard unit, and they'd been in Iraq until sort of all through 2006, and then they got extended, and they left after 16 months in 2007. And they had seen really nothing but violence and not a lot of improvement. And the day that they were originally supposed to have gone home, on their 12-month mark, 2 guys got killed in an IED blast. And they felt pretty dark about the deployment, right? And what had happened. And it was interesting because the unit that replaced them came in right as violence was starting to drop off a cliff, and they had a radically different experience. But this unit was feeling pretty dark. And I set up a video teleconference between them, and there was a town hall back in home, where they all came from, and like the senator was going to be there, and the mayor, and so on, and all, a bunch of families. And the unit selected a group of soldiers who were going to represent this National Guard unit. And so, these were not like misfits. These were hand-selected soldiers by the unit. And I remember before they went on, them talking about like, are we going to tell them the truth about how we feel? And I was like, no, we're not going to tell them the truth. Somebody says, you can tell them the truth when you get back home. And then this conversation breaks out like, are we going to tell them the truth when we get back home? How long before we tell them the truth? And I think a sort of counterpart to that is, how do you even figure out what the truth is, what you feel about it? There's a bit that I quote from Karl Merlantis in the book, from his book, What It's Like to Go to War. Merlantis was a Vietnam veteran. And he says, if you ask the 20-year-old combat veteran at the gas station what it feels like to kill a man, his probable angry answer is that it doesn't feel like a thing. But if you ask him the same question 40 years later, you might get a very different response, right? Which is not just going to be about who that guy was and what he experienced, but also about the people that he had around him, how they either helped him process the experience or not. And so, the section on writing is not, or at least in my mind, it's not just, I'm a writer and I'm interested in aesthetic questions and et cetera, but I actually think it's related to a very vital human need, right? How do we communicate things that are sort of outside the experience of most people, yet are vitally important to us, and which we need to talk to other people about in order for us to have any kind of purchase on it at all? And then the final question, the section is faith. And that is really, I think that war calls up political questions, strategic questions, et cetera, but I also think that because the stakes in war are life or death, they ultimately call into question sort of broader spiritual concerns. And those are the essays in the book that attempt to grapple with that.
Reading the book for me personally was deeply therapeutic. And I just found myself, I'm nodding constantly throughout. You address so many of the different issues that I had wrestled with when I came home, and including to a degree, your and my role as public affairs folks, where, anything I did, I spent about 2 years total in various Afghanistan, Iraq. And I came home with a big sense of sort of that imposter syndrome, folks like, thank you for your service. And I'd be like, I didn't, I went, yeah. I was at a headquarters. I saw a few things, but mostly it wasn't much different than being anywhere else. One thing that really strikes me in the example you gave there of that guard unit was that, are we going to tell them the truth? And that resonates with me in terms of our role as public affairs officers. Because I certainly have many people say, oh, you were the spin doctor. You were the guys who controlled information. And I'd kind of chuckle and say, that's an area people just didn't understand. So we weren't controlling information at all, not in this day and age. But that idea of, are we going to tell them the truth? And one thing that resonates with me in that example, Phil, is that it was individuals processing what they would talk about. That wasn't some structure and deliberate plan and public affairs organization or approved messaging. That was individuals, all of us coming home saying, what is our truth? How do we explain this? What will we share? What can we share? What can't we? And I think individually we've all wrestled. So there's a thank you embedded in there for the book from me personally, because it has helped me process some very complicated things.
I think that's true. I didn't see my role as a public affairs officer as spinning. And it was interesting because I wasn't, when they were having that conversation, I wasn't telling them what they should say to their families, right? Sort of was looking at them thinking to myself, like, well, this could get really ugly and really awkward. But, I was just there trying to help them communicate back to their families the things that they wanted to say, honestly. Yeah. And it was, their conversation. I mean, obviously you are constrained, right? As a public affairs officer, I'm much more free to talk about things in the military now that I'm out. I did see my job as delivering truthful information to people. And we had media embeds who we knew were not going to tell positive stories about what we were doing, right? It wasn't any surprise to us, but that never caused me any sort of sense of conflict. If there was a journalist who I thought was hostile, I wouldn't want to serve up a Lance Corporal as an interview to them to be mocked publicly. But
I found if we ever, and so we are sort of getting into the whole, what was our career or our field here. I found if we gave our troops the basic guidance to, this is my machine gun and this is my machine gun barrel bag, that's your thing, talk about that, go. That they would say candid things from time to time, but as a public affairs guy, I could always put it in the context of, hey, we've taught them to speak their mind. They're speaking about what they experienced. And now let us give you the official context of what the mission was and how the military is subservient to civil authorities, and we carry out those missions so long as they're lawful, all of the packaged material, but then got the power of the storytelling and into your discussions, many of them about citizenship and our responsibility and governance within a democracy, all that allowed our troops to tell the stories that were personal so people could have the information they needed to try and understand. That was a powerful thing.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Phil, for starting the discussion. As I said at the top of the interview, I think before we began recording, this is a special one for me because obviously you both had a crossover in your careers in the Marine Corps as public affairs officers. So this interview is an opportunity for me to learn a little bit more about my co-host Cliff here. He's very gracious, doesn't talk too much about his career in the Marine Corps. I'd like to return back to your book, Phil, here for a moment. It's right there in the subtitle. Arguably, your book is ultimately a meditation on American citizenship. what that means, what freedoms that gives us, and what responsibilities we have to ourselves, our country, and our men and women in uniform. And that inquiry serves as a remarkable springboard to the at times jarring reality that on any given day, our country is busy killing people across great swaths of the world. What you refer to as an age of endless and invisible war that emerged from the smoldering ashes of 9/11. I'd like us to listen to you frame this issue in this book. Let me go ahead and play a section.
How to speak meaningfully of a conflict that has lasted so long and at such a low ebb that most Americans can pretend it isn't happening. No one cares if Americans aren't being killed, the journalist Jonah Goldberg recently argued. Nor should they care if Americans aren't being killed. As far as public opinion goes, he's largely right. And yet, whether or not war still captures the attention of the public, it still captures the attention of the Defense Department, which continues long-running and extremely lethal campaigns in various theaters of conflict. We may not be losing as many soldiers as we used to, since our role in wars has shifted to one of training, support, and the provision of air power and high-tech know-how, but we're certainly killing plenty of people.
For those of you listening, that is the audible version of Uncertain Ground, available on Amazon. Returning to that passage, if our men and women in uniform can strike safely at bad actors from over the horizon, then why, in your opinion, should any American care if we indeed remain transfixed in an age of endless invisible war? And why do you think this is a significant enough issue to lead as the subtitle of your latest book?
Well, I think that war is the most morally fraught thing that a nation can do. So it should concern all of us. And I think it should concern all of us that so much is done with very little public input, right? If we care about democracy at all and we care about our responsibilities as citizens, that should be of concern. And there have been a variety of not just technological changes, but political decisions, right, which have obscured war making from view. And sort of to give you a few examples, the authorization for the use of military force that was passed in 2001 was passed after 9/11 to allow us to strike the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, associated forces, right? And since that time, it has been used for almost anybody that the administration wants to go after, right? The Obama administration famously extended it to apply to ISIS, even though ISIS didn't exist at the time, because, and I think it was essentially for political reasons. They had pulled out of Iraq with great fanfare. And then after the rise of ISIS, they wanted to go back and fight against ISIS, which, by the way, is a mission that I have no real problem with, right? I have been through areas in Sinjar where there was a genocide, and I've spoken with women who were enslaved by ISIS. I'm perfectly fine with the fact that we used military power to try and push back against the Islamic State. But while the Obama administration was ramping up the number of troops and the extent of our involvement in a quite bloody war, they were telling Americans that we weren't at war. They were saying, well, we're not putting boots on the ground, right? As if special operators float around on hoverboards. When special operator got into combat, they were saying, well, no, we're not sending troops into combat, though sometimes troops end up in a combat situation. And critically, they weren't going to Congress and asking Congress to vote on the new mission, right? Which I think is really important. I think that if we're going to be killing people overseas, then the president should have to go before Congress, explain what the mission is, explain what the benchmarks of success are going to be, explain how much it's going to cost, and then all our representatives should vote on it, right? Because I think there needs to be accountability. What you have in the absence of that is war making that is totally ceded to the executive. You have policy that isn't sort of thoughtfully designed military policy, but policy designed for the least political cost. And, with a lack of accountability, I think comes a lack of seriousness. We've done things like this before in history. Small wars don't always stay small. And I have a lot of doubts about a policy where there's sort of broad swaths of the world where our primary engagement with the people of those areas is when we sort of emerge from the skies and kill people. Right. So I don't think that you get good military policy. I think even from a purely just military point of view, I think this is likely to end in disaster. And, it's not as if you have kind of more serious congressional accountability that's going to ensure good policy, right? We're perfectly capable of screwing things up, but I don't think you have a chance if you don't have accountability. And that's just one of a variety of ways. I mean, there's other things. Cliff and I were talking about being public affairs officers and feeling that even if we knew an embed wasn't going to give us positive coverage, we needed to allow those guys in to see what the troops are doing and report on it. And because we had American flag on our uniform and we worked for the people. We didn't work ultimately for the military, but in service of America and the Constitution, and they had a right to know what we're doing. Well, the DoD doesn't allow embeds anymore. It's been a while since we've had embedded reporters. And I don't like this situation where there's far too much secrecy, far too much happens in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Biden just sent an increase of troops to Somalia. And it was initially leaked to the press and then sort of vague statements about what was going to happen. We don't really know exactly what the mission is. We know they're going to continue, sort of kill capture program that has gone on in Somalia for a while, how this is related to the national interest, why they think that al-Shabaab really is a threat to America that justifies this kind of presence. But the long-term goal for the region is, other than simply, killing people periodically to make sure they don't get too far out of control, which is an approach to counterterrorism that I have a lot of sort of grave concerns about in terms of the long-term effects, because I think if there's anything from the past 2 decades that we've learned, it's that, oftentimes it's the second and third order consequences of violence that are really important and can be of massive strategic importance as well. And yet we're not debating any of that stuff. We're not forcing the administration to really articulate how this fits into their broader policy and what that policy is, and what the rationale is sort of justifying these kinds of strikes. I think it's very dangerous in the long term, and I think that it can't be justified morally. And I think that it's, as a democracy, at odds with who we're supposed to be.
You raise issues there that lead me towards sort of my experience out there. It was different every time I went. So 3 times, Fallujah, and then Kandahar, and then Helmand. And each time the mission changed a little, and each time the conditions on the ground were different. And I came away feeling like what we had done is fought 21-year wars, and they were what was the politically expedient mission at the time. And I don't know that we would have succeeded had we committed on the front end to, say, 15 years or 10. But I found myself thinking that it would have been better for the country if on the front end, instead of saying this is going to be fast, we had said, this is serious, we're going in, we're committing to this, and it could be 10 or 15 years. And it's possible that the public would have said no, or Congress would have said no. And in my mind, that may have been the way it should have been. I'm not saying we shouldn't have stayed or whatnot, but if our legislators had said no to a 15 or 20-year incursion on the front end, that to me seems beneficial to sneaking a 20-year war in 1-year increments. And I used the word earlier, abrogation of authority. That is the word I choose to use on what I watched Congress do. They hold the purse strings, and that's how they control the executive when it comes to war making. But it is sobering to think back that we haven't formally declared war since World War II. And yet we've been at war for more years than not since then. I'm curious where we go from here if so many of your essays that were written over a span of time almost point to where we've ended up. And I'm curious on your thoughts of what next and where do we go from here with Afghanistan sort of wrapping up, but that's no indicator that we've stopped this endless invisible war. As you mentioned, we're still trickling it out here and there. People are still being killed in the name of American citizens. And many of us may not even be aware that is happening. And then as we look to current things unfolding within the political realm, where do we go, Phil? Solve America.
It is very strange, right? Because we've very much turned inward. And if you look at a guy like Eric Greitens, I have an essay on Greitens in the book. And Greitens was a Navy SEAL, though he never actually served in combat with SEAL teams. And after the death of Osama bin Laden, he had a memoir out, and he kind of went on cable news and gave interviews talking about how SEALs did things, and his star rose alongside the public obsession with Navy SEALs. And he was very good at sort of discerning what his audience wanted and delivering it back to them, right? And when he started out in the first decade of our wars, he was a humanitarian. He started a actually really great nonprofit that's still around called The Mission Continues, which was all about service and bringing veterans back into their communities to do service projects. And, it was good for the veterans and good for the communities to have people doing that kind of civic work, and it became a launching pad for other nonprofits that still exist today that are doing very good work. And then in the second decade of the wars, he went into politics and ran for governor. And he adopted a much harder edge and was, cutting ads with him shooting guns and blowing things up. There's one Navy SEAL who was very frustrated with Greitens' use of the SEAL imagery, put it to me. He's like, because Greitens was never in combat with SEALs. He's like, this guy, you see that ad where he's blowing things up? This guy, the only thing he blew up is the Republican Party, right? Mm-hmm. And during that campaign, he sold bumper stickers that said ISIS hunting permit. It was like, liberals will go crazy when they see this. Just kind of like sort of dumb trolling kind of approach to politics, but focused on a foreign enemy, right? And just last week, he put out a advertisement. So he lost the governorship after a scandal where he tied a woman up and was alleged to have forced a sex act on her and blackmailed her. And there were also like campaign finance violations and felony invasion of privacy charges. And sort of seemed like his career in politics was done, but in the new era of shamelessness, he's back. He's leading in the polls in a Missouri Senate race, and he cut an ad where he leads like a group of guys in camouflage holding guns to go rhino hunting, Republican in name only hunting, and now he's selling rhino hunting permits on his website. And he's very obviously trying to like generate horrified reaction to a provocation. But it's interesting, the switch between ISIS hunting permit and rhino hunting permit, right? And this has happened before, like, disappointed nationalists after many wars have sort of decided that if we can't have successful wars, at least we can fantasize about murdering each other. It's just it's an ugly place in politics. And he's not the only, there's another Navy SEAL who's actually in Congress, Dan Crenshaw, who cut a extremely cringeworthy ad during the Georgia special election where it's shot like a superhero movie, and he jumps out of an airplane and lands on a car with guys who are supposed to be in Antifa and attacks them. And it's kind of sort of darkly fascinating to see how national Republican figures think that what the audience wants to see is sort of fantasies of them attacking other Americans versus the, much more service and civic engagement rhetoric of a decade ago. And I don't really think, or at least I hope not, that is a smart bet on their part. I think that there's certainly a kind of type of discourse that you especially see highlighted online that's very much driven by contempt and rage. One thing that I did find interesting, though, there was a survey of sort of civic health of veterans that was done recently, actually done in partnership with the Mission Continues, Greitens' old nonprofit, which is still around and still continues to do good work. And they found that not only do veterans take part in civic organizations more and volunteer more and vote more than your average civilian population, but especially younger veterans do. And the numbers of younger veterans who do those things has been increasing over the past 5 years, not decreasing. And so my hope, anyway, is that even though there's a style of kind of national politics, which is totally dysfunctional and inward facing and full of contempt and hate and rage, and also just a profound lack of seriousness, you shouldn't be trolling as a national candidate. Ha ha ha. I'm going to pretend at violence. And then, when people call me on it, I'm going to act like they're rubes for taking it seriously so that I can sort of have my cake and eat it too. It's like grow up, right? But that hopefully beneath that, I think there's a desire for something a lot healthier and less insubstantial at the end of the day, less pathetic.
Phil, I take a little bit of heart in sort of the cyclic arc of American history. We've had these cycles of times when the country was tested. And, and there's the specific markers like, the world wars, the Civil War, certainly the American Civil War.
You want to talk about sort of inward turn to violence. I mean, after World War I, and I read about this in one of the books because I have a piece about Iraqi interpreters who served with U.S. troops in combat, one of whom made it to America and then joined the military and went back to Iraq as a soldier. And another one who at the time of the writing was still stuck in Iraq, trying to make his way through a very broken immigration system to help bring people over who are at risk because of their service to us. Thankfully, after the piece was published, he did eventually get to America. He's driving a truck now.
But that was Ted, right?
Yep. Yeah. It's doing
Made
good.
it back. Good.
And I contrast that with a story from World War I. Charles White Whittlesey, who was one of the great heroes of the war, but also very idealistic, right? And one of the things that was always left out of the story of his unit, which was surrounded by German troops, but held out for days despite running out of supplies. They ran out of bandages. They were stripping bandages off the dead to put on the living. Well, that unit was from the Melting Pot Battalion. So it was full of, a diverse array of new immigrants. And after the war, Whittlesey eventually got sick of public events and uncomfortable with the way that he was idolized. But he would show up for some events, like one in New York City with immigrants, where he specifically talked about faith that he had in America, residing in the kinds of new immigrants that he saw in his unit who would step up when the time came. And he was at the burial interment of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Mm-hmm. He was one of the pallbearers. It was this over-the-top production. The president, Congress was there, the Supreme Court, a choir from the Metropolitan Opera was singing hymns comparing the soldier to Christ because he'd given his life for an ideal. And of course, to somebody like Whittlesey, all the ideals that he had believed in hadn't really come to the forefront. And not only that, but there was anti-immigrant violence. There were the first quota laws in American immigration history that were being passed. There was the Red Summer, violence against Black Americans, and especially Black veterans were targeted. If you, were a Black veteran wearing your military uniform, that was making a claim on America that white racists could not abide. And so you had multiple cases of Black veterans being lynched after World War I for the crime of having served their country and being proud of it. And after the internment of the unknown soldier, he put his affairs in order. He boarded a ship, and then he jumped over the side, sinking beneath the waves, killing himself in a way that ensured that nobody could ever treat his body the same way. Yeah, it's a grim story, but it's also one that I think shows us these sort of cycles of reaction, shows us how military imagery sometimes gets used to obscure the actual people who do sometimes serve. And also, I was hoping to show in those stories a sort of different conception of American identity, which is also present in our history, and which is much more about embracing that change. And, Ralph Ellison talks about America as an abstract, futuristic nation, right? It's not about fixing a date and time and deciding this ethnically defined people on this particular piece of land is what America is, but rather something much more open-ended and in flux. And that American identity is about being able to embrace that and live in the midst of it.
Phil, I think it's been a long and zigzagging path from the original language of all men are created equal towards meaning all people. And when I talk of that cycle, the cynical side of me would be, we keep repeating that cycle. The optimistic side of me says, but we've moved forward each time so far. I think one thing that concerns me about almost our own sort of the mythology of America is that it seems we have a tendency to look back at those times and cycle and believe that we came through them inevitably, that, we were destined to win the Civil War. The Union was destined to stay together. That's the World War I, World War II, that it was just, America was going to do this. And that we do perhaps lose sight of the fact that those cycles, those points were not destiny, that they were uncertain, and that we were many, many times on the verge of collapse or dissolution. I feel that we may be in one of those periods now. I think it's difficult to claim it and say so because it can seem melodramatic, and that maybe it's one of those things that until you're beyond it so that historians can write about it, it really can't be put into the context of the greater cycle. But what are your thoughts there on, if you had to throw yourself out on, here are the scales, optimism, pessimism, what makes you optimistic, and what could be done? What can Joe Citizen, whether veteran or not, do perhaps today? What would you recommend to keep the country moving forward?
Ultimately, I am optimistic. I mean, the book ends on a somewhat dark note, right? Because the last essay in the book, it's written in August of last year, and it's written during the fall of Kabul and this desperate attempt to bring people who worked for us, whose lives are at risk, out of Afghanistan in the wake of government failure and indifference. The Biden administration, I supported the withdrawal. I think it didn't make sense for us to continue to keep troops in Afghanistan for a whole variety of reasons, but they showed no real concern for American allies and people whose lives were at risk essentially because they believed in us. And so there were a lot of people left behind in Kabul. It was an insane scramble at the end. The administration did not refuse to really plan for it, despite the fact that, I met with activists in the humanitarian community months before then who were talking about this, their increasingly frantic attempts to get the Biden administration to take this seriously and just getting blocked at every turn. So the optimism that we're going to, sort of move forward as a wiser and better country in the long term doesn't do a lot of good for, for example, this one Afghan that I was talking to via video chat not long after American troops had left, and he's in his apartment. He doesn't really leave. They'd already had to leave their home once before because of death threats from the Taliban and death threats to his child, actually, one of his children. And he tells me, he says, it's 9 o'clock. It's too late. It's too early to go to bed. But look, and he goes to the bedroom where his children are sleeping. It's like they're all in bed, because they don't have anything else to do. And he's got 4 kids, 3 girls, who are always asking him what this means for them as a girl in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. And he says to me, he says, as a father, you have so many hopes and dreams for your children, and now there are no hopes, no dreams. This is real life, and there's nothing here. And he worked for Americans. That's why he had death threats. And what good is it to him if 20 years from now America learns better lessons? So that's something to keep in mind. I think that a certain amount of optimism about the long trajectory of American history shouldn't allow us to feel okay with the thousands and thousands and thousands of people like that who we could have helped but just didn't because we chose not to care. I mean, I know guys who were working immigration cases where the people they were working on got murdered. I know a guy who was working with this one woman. She was in a hospital under a fake name, hidden by doctors because the Taliban had, put her on a kill list. She'd been beaten so horribly that she had a tube in her stomach, draining fluid. And she's trying to work the Byzantine US immigration process to get her documents in order. Think of the most hellish DMV appointment you've ever had, except you're doing it while hiding from the Taliban with a tube draining fluid from your lungs. And she's talking to this one vet who's, working these cases, who is doing it as a private citizen because his interpreter saved his life when he was in Afghanistan. And he said to me, he's like, why would I ever stop doing everything I can? I feel like my government's failed in their obligation. And so that falls to me, right? But he's just a private citizen. There's only so much he can do. And in her mind, he's America. He could send a Black Hawk helicopter and pick her up if he wanted to, but he's just choosing not to, right? But of course he can't. And she says to him, why are our lives not worth saving?
The degree of betrayal done at the national level is just mind-blowing, and certainly it's not about me. Certainly in this case, it's much more about Wise, whose dad was in Kabul when everything fell, and it took quite a bit of work to get him back here into the States. But naturally, we tend to think of us ourselves individually, and I find myself thinking that what my nation did in my name is not what I served to do. It's not the values that were, you talked about Officer Candidate School and having some of those sort of core values drumbeat into us. And then also a couple of instructors who talked to us a bit more candidly about things that were the realities of warfare. But the heart of it, honor, courage, and commitment, and semper fidelis, and those things, I still desperately want to hold those and believe those as an ideal. But I came away watching the whole thing collapse around us, watching anything that I had personally contributed to unwind. I went into Fallujah, then Fallujah fell. And I went into a town called Nowzad, which was nothing but a gunfight. And then I went back and we had town council meetings, and then it fell. And then, Helmand fell behind us as we left. I watched that thinking that I can't avoid the fact that it is me that did that, I am part of the machine that carried out that betrayal. I'm part of that machine that did the 21-year wars rather than committing. And that's a huge wrestling match, none of which is any scale or comparison to what you were describing and the individual lives that are being affected by it. So any thought I might have about what was done to me by this is petty. It's paltry. And I mean, it's what I wrestle with, but it's no comparison whatsoever to.
I don't think it's petty. I think there's always a sort of temptation to say, like, because other people have it worse, the thing that concerns me and strikes to the core of my sense of myself and who I am is meaningless. No, it's not meaningless. It's just not the worst thing in the world. And when you're talking about war, there are always people who've experienced the worst thing in the world, right? I think it's very important because it's tied to not just your own personal sense of identity, but that sense of identity in relationship to broader institutions and the country that you're a part of. And this is, you're asking me about sort of ways forward. And I think that it's very easy to look at the sum total of problems in America and think, oh, we're screwed. But, and again, this is one of the benefits of looking at history. You can look at history and go, oh my God, it was so much worse before, right? And yet, what did people do? They organized. They didn't just have strongly felt moral opinions that they threw out into the public sphere in a hopeless cry of despair. They joined other people in institutions and organizations seeking to course correct. And that's how progress is made. Solidarity, through organizing, through joining with other people in a thick way.
And through participating as citizens.
Exactly.
Which
is more than just having opinion, right?
Yes.
And voting.
You already shared with us that Uncertain Ground ends in a way with the consequences of not paying attention, of not being engaged as a citizen or as an American in an age of endless invisible war, in the outcome of how a 20-year effort in Afghanistan restored the very same group that provided protection to Al-Qaeda back into power, the architects of 9/11. A shocking outcome for our country, our men and women in uniform who gave so much in the battlefield, and of course, the Afghan people. We understand that it was a dim moment for our country. But in your book, and you put it so beautifully, these essays consist of so many broken fragments of my faith in love of America. The very first chapter. What amongst these broken fragments do you see as giving you that enduring faith and love in this country, as great and flawed as it is?
Well, I think hopefully you'll see it through the book, right? I mean, we were just talking about how in war, there's always the worst things that you could possibly imagine happening. There's also things that are really quite beautiful, right? You see extreme selflessness, and you see real dedication to the broader whole. You see self-sacrifice. You see a lot of the qualities that we actually need as a country. And I'm thinking of courage, not just sort of physical courage. I knew a Marine named Nick Zaros briefly. Very good kid. He was an infantry guy. I knew him because a friend of his had died saving his life, Jordan Herter, who, along with Corporal Jonathan Yell, had fired on an explosive-laden truck, forcing an early detonation, which killed the two of them, as they undoubtedly knew that would have, but it saved all the Marines behind them in the combat outpost. And Zaros is one of those. And, the two fallen Marines received the Navy Cross, and I did interviews for it. And Zaros was one of the guys. And through that, I introduced him to a captain from another unit who was going to Afghanistan. He volunteered to go to Afghanistan. And I asked Nick why, and he said he knew that Afghanistan was where the fighting was at that time. This was 2009. And he knew that the unit that was going over was going to have a tough deployment. And he knew what it was like to lose somebody that you were close to, and then have to go out the next day and do the mission when all you want to do is grieve. And he thought he could help that unit. And he died in an IED blast a few months later in Afghanistan. And, when I think about courage, right, there are the cases like Jordan Herter and Jonathan Yell, right? People in the moment who make a choice, which is what we normally think of. But IEDs are the number one killer of Marines and soldiers, or have been over these wars. And those don't offer any room for heroics. They're just anonymous blasts on the road. And yet, I think of Zaros first, usually, when I think of courage. Not because of battlefield heroics, but because of a very quiet determination while at peace, after the kind of experiences that shred illusions about combat and grandeur and glory that most young people go into the Corps with, and him deciding to go over anyway because he thought he could help other human beings, other young Marines. And I think there are more people like that than too much focus on our dysfunctional politics would lead us to consider.
I think that's beautifully articulated. I've certainly been given hope in my life by the kindness and small acts of grace by Americans that I simply don't know. And I think it speaks to the best elements of our country. I think that the military community and their response in the aftermath of our withdrawal speaks to a part of our character too.
This is worth mentioning because let me tell you something that's not in the book. So in the last essay, which as I mentioned is angry, and it felt right for it to be the last essay. and to be a little unsettling for the reader, right? And there's a Marine that I knew, former Marine, who was involved in evacuation efforts, right? Which was just a brutal and chaotic and unjust process, right? And so really just painful in every way and heartbreaking. And he'd been in Afghanistan 10 years before as an infantryman, and now he was doing this. And he says, he told me, this is in the book, everyone wants to know, am I okay? And I'm like, really? Is the burden of feeling guilty about this also a burden veterans have to carry too? Not only did you not care about Afghanistan, not only did you not follow Afghanistan, it's like you gave such a little shit. You can't even feel bad yourself. Could somebody else please take some of this, take some responsibility? I'm so fucking tired of it, and it's killing me. And it shouldn't be fucking me up this much. So that's how he was feeling in August. And I talked to him a couple months later to check in on him. And this is not in the book because it happened later. And he'd been resettling Afghans and still working on evacuation, right? Because that work continues. Actually, he texted me just a couple weeks ago about one of the cases that he sort of hadn't been able to get out in August, finally getting out. And he was feeling a lot better. And one of the things that he said is he'd been doing this resettlement work and all kinds of people had showed up, right? People with no connection to Afghanistan or the military. And he said to me, he said, all this time I thought that Americans didn't care. But actually, like, a lot of people will step up when you ask them to.
Yes.
And I think one of the tragedies of the past 20 years is that our politicians haven't asked us.
You wrote a bit about the militaries at war, Americans are at the mall. And I had that issue came up in some of my own much less prolific and well-known writing, but discussion with folks as well, that my own Marines told me that at one point. And I remember having a response at one point, still in the service, of, well, that is the point. That is what and at the time I thought, I get this, I follow this. The purpose of that approach was that we wanted to go forward, go deploy, fight this fight out there so that the whole country wasn't disrupted, so the whole country wasn't engaged. And at the time I told my Marines, well, that's the point. Don't be mad about that right now. That's the path we chose. The whole purpose was we go so they don't have to know. And I'm caught now by your words and my own thought evolving that was an error. That two major errors that I would see on that. One, we spoke of the abrogation of congressional authority to control the purse strings, control the war. And the second being that by cutting America out, by not allowing America to participate, we led to exactly that circumstance where the citizenry was not involved. And not only cut out, but from weighing in on it, but cut out from participating, cut out from donating scrap metal, cut out from rationing their food, cut out from not having enough fuel, cut out from helping roll bandages. All of those things that, as we read through the arc of history, that the citizenry was called to do in order to support the effort that was a national effort. And the so-called global war on terror, in my retrospective, was not a national effort. It was deliberately compartmentalized. And I would say then that what I'm hearing from you there, Phil, and apologies if I'm putting words into your mouth there, but what I'm hearing is that we need to have that call, that we need to participate and challenge others to participate and to contribute and to be active citizens. And that is the path towards an optimistic outcome through the current arc of history.
Yeah, I think there are two things that need to be disentangled. There's a desire for more political accountability and civic participation. Nothing wrong with that. And there's contempt of civilian life.
Yes.
And that is the poisonous one, right? And that is a temptation. It's a temptation when you come back alienated, feeling like people aren't accepting their moral and political relationship to the killing that is done in their name. The temptation is always for that to curdle into a kind of resentment. And, you see this, like, who's the guy, Rob O'Neill, the Navy SEAL who claims to have shot Osama bin Laden, has kind of like made a career out of being that guy. Every time there's something that happens in American political life that, that he doesn't like, he'll go on Twitter and say something like, I can't believe I sacrificed for you people.
Which is the exact opposite of service and sacrifice.
Right. Yeah. It's not especially classy.
One of your great concerns in this book, correct me if I'm wrong, is about how us citizens are pulling away from our government, and how our government is pulling away from us citizens, and how our armed forces are also kind of left in a limbo because of this gravitational dissonance. It has arguably led to a state of uncertain ground, the title of your book. And we Americans are clearly uncertain about our future as a country. And uncertainty is a prelude to despair, then anger, then rage. You explored this in the article titled Public Rage Won't Solve Our Problems. I'd like to play a section of that.
Rage seems like a perfectly natural and justified response to our broader political dysfunction. From healthcare to tax policy to climate change, we are failing to meaningfully address issues whose impact can be measured in human lives. And invitations to civil debate can sometimes be nothing more than a con carried out by malign actors within the system. The conservative entertainer Ann Coulter used to play a game where she'd say something horrible, and then, when questioned about it, shift to a thinly connected but defensible argument. Like when she claimed on the Today Show that she'd written that a group of politically active 9/11 widows were enjoying their husbands' deaths, only to call attention to how they were using their grief in order to make a political point. The game, one suspects, is less about sparking debate than indulging in a kind of performative contempt. So why play that game when the simple extension of a middle finger is both easier and more honest? It will, at the very least, be more fun. Clearly, stoking rage and contempt in the public square can work. It excites us. It gives us courage to act in the face of uncertainty. We never fully know others, or their motivations, or the extent of their virtues and vices. But if, instead of acknowledging that, we reduce them to the least charitable caricature possible, it allows us to feel we're on certain ground. But we're never on certain ground. And while abandoning a process of thoughtful deliberation can win you power, what it can never do is give you a hope of using that power wisely.
We certainly, as a nation, stand on the precipice of a great, I don't know what to call it, a great shouting match in the months ahead. I'm pretty confident of that. Roe versus Wade was overturned today. Cliff and I were talking about that. The specter of Donald Trump and his hold on the Republican Party and his involvement in unsettling our democracy on January 6th hangs as a pall over our nation. And we have, as a people, regardless of whether you're on the left or the right end of the spectrum, have become immersed in outrage politics because it is so incredibly powerful and persuasive. But this is now taking us down an uncertain and dangerous road as a country. And I'm curious, over the course of your decades-long work on these essays, what, in your opinion, is some of the ways back from this?
Yeah, it does go back to what I said earlier when I was talking about joining with other people in organizations and institutions. The sum total of problems in American life are bigger than any one of us. Even any individual area is bigger than any one of us. But whatever it is you care most deeply about, there are organizations and people who are doing practical work in that space, trying to improve things for the better. And so, I think the role is actual participation, organizing with other people, and not being so sucked into the constant swirl of national politics, right? But rather having core issues that drive you, that you care about very deeply, and that you actually do sort of real work in terms of trying to push things along. I think that in an odd way, like, if you're looking at, for example, a conservative court that is issuing opinions that you don't like, one of the questions is how they succeeded, right? Which is building up institutions in the legal profession to get there. So, and that was a decades-long process. So the question really is, what kind of institutions can be built or joined that are doing the kind of work to create the sorts of changes that you'd like to see?
Right. I often find myself thinking rage is tactical. It can get you through the near term, but it's not strategic. It's not going to get you towards a longer path. And it's so hard to focus on long-term goals and objectives when you're busy just being angry.
I'm plenty angry. Yeah. I mean, a lot of these essays were written, the starting place was anger.
Yeah.
Anger can be a just emotion. It's just not enough on its own.
Yeah. It doesn't carry you in the long game. I found it tends to burn a person out. But it absolutely is a legitimate emotion and can be certainly an excellent catalyst.
So I don't want to jump too far ahead here. Uncertain Ground just came out this May,
Mhm.
2022. Obviously, a lot of work went into it. As you said, it's not every opinion article you ever wrote over the course of your career as a writer.
Yeah.
It is a carefully curated selection to move a reader along a certain debate within yourself as a writer and as a citizen, as a veteran, and as a person, I might add. I'm curious as to, obviously, when it comes to asking what is next for you or what are you working on at the moment, there are times when, as a creative, for whatever reason,
Oh, no,
you
I'm
want
happy
keep
to
that
tell you.
under lock and lid.
Yeah.
But I'm curious as to where are you headed next as an author?
So my maternal grandfather was ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 1976 to 1978, right, which is a very interesting time in Czech history. Charter 77 happened then. During that time, my grandmother was asked to pass messages to the communists, so the Catholic resistance to the communists. And so I figured I would write a 1970s spy story based on family history.
Oh, how cool.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just, as this book notes, I'm very interested in sort of the American presence in the world. And that was a kind of really interesting time. And my family had a particular relationship to it. And so, yeah, that's what I'm sort of slowly working on. And it's been fascinating.
Well, I would read that. Of course, you have the added advantage that I basically read, forward, share anything that you put together. And Phil, I want to congratulate you on the success that you are experiencing. You were one of those folks that I observed and said, hey, this guy's going to set his goals and go. I know it's never as smooth and simple and easy as that, that from the outside looking in, you got the books, got the awards, got the pub, but there's so much life and everything behind it, which broadens my appreciation for the fact that you have moved forward on that goal to, what you told me early on. I'm here to learn and observe a few things, and then I'm going to go be a writer. Phil, you have done that, and I commend you for that. And in a sense, I'm as envious as I will allow myself to be that you have the discipline to carry that out and the talent to make it worth reading. Truly do. I want to thank you for the time you've had here. I want you to have my personal appreciation for sharing the time with us. And then I'll hand back to Wise for where he wants to go next.
Thank you, Cliff. It's awesome to see you.
I would like to thank you, Phil, for coming to speak with us here in the Ask. Once again, the conversation was for his latest book, Uncertain Ground, An Age of Endless Invisible War, that is now widely available over Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, Bookshop, IndieBound, and your better bookstore anywhere nearby you here in the United States and around the world. Phil Klay, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much.